In November of 1883, a woman named Shane Ford rode through a blizzard to a homestead cabin 9 miles outside of Harlan, Colorado territory, carrying a leather bag of instruments she had packed 4 years before she ever set foot on a westbound train. The snow was horizontal. The temperature had dropped past 20 below. She had been in Harlan for 8 months, and in those 8 months the town had never quite decided what to do with her. That question, which had lingered like smoke in a closed room since the March morning she stepped off the train at the Harlan Depot, was going to be answered that night in a one-room cabin without an audience. The town would hear about it later. And when it did, it would not say very much. That is how it usually went with the things that mattered most in Harlan. The council's letter had gone out in January of 1883, composed by Aldous Price in his capacity as chairman, and copied in a fair hand by Cora Briggs, who served as postmistress and kept better records than anyone on the council cared to acknowledge. The letter was addressed to a medical college in St. Louis, and it requested a physician, trained and willing to practice in a frontier settlement of 400 souls at an elevation of 7,000 feet, where the nearest hospital sat 112 miles to the north by wagon road. The letter described the hardships plainly, because Price was a practical man when it suited him, and it offered a small stipend drawn from the town fund, plus a rented surgery room above the feed supply. It did not specify a man. It did not need to, in Price's estimation. Some things went without saying. The college's placement officer read the letter, noted the stipend, considered the class of graduates it had recently produced, and wrote back in February to say that a qualified physician would board the Denver-bound train on the 1st of March. The name on the placement letter was S. Ford. Cora Briggs, who had been postmistress for 6 years and had developed a fine sense for the things a name did and did not tell you, read the letter twice and set it on Price's desk without comment. She had her own thoughts. She kept them. Shane Ford, 26 years old and 4 weeks clear of her final examination, packed her instrument bag in a rooming house on Chestnut Street in St. Louis on the last evening of February. The bag was plain brown leather, brass clasped, bought second-hand from a surgeon who had retired to a quieter city and a quieter practice. She packed it with care, the forceps nested in oilcloth, the probe and lancet wrapped separately, the bottle of carbolic solution stoppered and wedged at the side, the stethoscope folded last, on top, where she could reach it quickly. She had been told by her mentor, a woman named Dr. Eliza Marsh, who had been practicing since 1861 and had seen enough of the world to speak plainly, that the West would be harder than the exam. Dr. Marsh had not said this to discourage her. She had said it the way you describe the terrain before someone begins a long ride. So they pack accordingly. Shane had taken it as a caution. She had packed accordingly. The train ride from St. Louis to Denver took 4 days and covered 1,100 miles of flattening country. Shane spent most of it reading, a habit she had formed in childhood and never lost, working through a volume on obstetric procedure she had borrowed from the college library and intended to return by mail once she had finished it. The plains outside the window grew wider, and then the mountains appeared to the west, distant and white-capped, and entirely indifferent to the train rolling toward them. She ate what was sold in the dining car, and slept in her seat and thought about what a surgery room above a feed supply would need before it was fit to receive a patient. She had a list. The Harlan Depot was a plank platform on the south edge of town, sheltered by a low roof and surrounded on 3 sides by open sky. When Shane stepped off the train on the morning of March the 3rd, carrying her instrument bag and a canvas travel case, the platform held 6 men from the town council and a loose knot of townspeople who had come to see the new doctor arrive. The day was cold and bright. The sky above the mountains was the particular blue that appears at elevation in early spring, clear and sharp and offering no warmth. Aldous Price stood at the front of the group. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a good coat, and the expression of a man who has organized something and is waiting for it to proceed as planned. He was looking at the train car's steps. He was waiting for a man to come down them. Shane came down them. She was not small, and she was not fragile-looking, and she was carrying the leather bag herself, rather than waiting for a porter, which Price registered without quite knowing what to make of it. She was wearing a dark gray wool traveling coat, and her hair was pinned under a plain hat, and she walked toward the waiting group with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had been walking toward things her whole life. Price looked past her at the train steps. Nobody else came down. The silence on the platform lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt longer. Shane set her canvas case down on the planks, shifted the instrument bag to her left hand, and extended her right to Price with the calm of a woman who had anticipated exactly this moment and had decided some time ago not to spend any energy on it. "Shane Ford," she said. "I'm the doctor your letter requested." Price shook her hand because the hand was there, and he was a man who prided himself on his manners, even when his manners were working faster than his thoughts. He said something about the journey. She said it had been fine. The other council members looked at their boots and at each other, and at the sky. The townspeople at the edge of the platform murmured without resolving into words. Nobody said a word about the problem, which was the same as saying a great deal about it. Cora Briggs was standing near the far end of the platform, half behind a support post, watching. She had come on her own time, not as a council representative. She had wanted to see how S. Ford walked off a train. She was satisfied with what she observed. The surgery room above the feed supply was exactly what Shane had expected, which was to say it was a square space with 2 windows, a plank floor with gaps between the boards, an iron stove that needed cleaning, and a smell of seed corn and turpentine that she could address but not fully eliminate. There was a table that served no identifiable purpose, a single chair, and a lamp with a cracked chimney. Price showed her the room on the morning of her arrival and told her the stipend came to $40 a month and the room was hers to arrange as she saw fit. He said these things standing in the doorway rather than entering, as though the room were still under consideration. Shane thanked him, set her instrument bag on the table, and when he had gone, she stood alone in the space and turned slowly to take its full measure. The gaps in the floor would let cold in. She would need to caulk them. The stove damper was stuck. She would need to work it loose and oil the joint. The lamp chimney needed replacing. The walls needed shelving, because a physician needed to keep supplies where she could find them in the dark, and there were no shelves. She began making the list longer. Within 2 weeks, she had caulked the floor gaps with strips of old cloth and a pot of pitch she bought from the hardware. She had built 2 shelves from pine planking and cut iron brackets from a sheet she found behind the feed supply with the permission of its owner, a quiet man named Dumas, who asked her no questions and charged her a fair price. She had replaced the lamp chimney, cleaned the stove, oiled the damper, and arranged her supplies in an order she could navigate without looking, the way her mentor had taught her. Carbolic on the upper left, laudanum secured and locked, catgut and needles in the second drawer, forceps and the obstetric kit in the oilcloth roll at the bottom of the instrument bag because they were the heaviest and the most likely to be needed in a hurry. The first patient came on the 3rd week of March, a child of 7 with a fever that had been climbing for 4 days. His mother brought him in the back way, through the alley behind the feed supply, and she stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set while Shane examined him as though she had not entirely decided whether this was a good idea. The fever broke on the second day. The boy was up and running by the fourth. The mother came back the following week with a jar of preserved plums and the particular expression of a woman who has been proven wrong about something and is not going to say so directly, but is not going to be impolite about it either. Shane accepted the plums and said they were a kindness. They were. Price heard about the boy's fever and said nothing. What he was thinking was that one fever was not a pattern, and that the council might want to write again to St. Louis to inquire about the availability of a more seasoned physician. He did not put this thought to paper immediately. He was a man who moved carefully, but he did not forget the thought, and over the weeks that followed he mentioned it in passing to two of the council members as something still under consideration. Cora Briggs heard that it was under consideration. She mentioned this to Shane on a Tuesday in April, leaning across the post office counter with the directness of a woman who had spent 6 years sorting other people's correspondence and had formed precise opinions about what needed to be said aloud. "Price is drafting a letter," Cora said. "I know," Shane said. "Do you want me to slow the outgoing mail?" "No," Shane said. "Let it go." Cora studied her for a moment, the way she studied a return address before accepting a package. Then she nodded and pushed a small stack of letters across the counter. The mail from Shane's mother in Ohio, a seed catalog she had not ordered but found useful, and a short note from Dr. Marsh in St. Louis that said simply, "Persistence is the only thing that cannot be taken from you." Shane folded the note and put it in her coat pocket and carried it with her for the rest of the spring. The months that followed were built from small things accumulated steadily, the way a wall is built, one stone at a time, each one depending on the ones below it. There was a man with a compound fracture from a logging accident in May. The tibia broken at a bad angle, and Shane said it cleanly and told him he could keep the leg. He had expected to lose it. He did not lose it. He walked with a slight hitch for the rest of his life and told people about it without prompting. There was a case of blood poisoning in June. A woman who had run a splinter deep into her palm and ignored it until the red line had climbed to her wrist, and Shane lanced and cleaned it and sat with her through 2 nights of fever while her husband waited outside in the hall and could not bring himself to come in. The woman survived. Her husband nodded at Shane on the street from then on, which was more than he had done before. There were the cases no one else in town would take, which were in some ways the most important, though not everyone understood them as such. In June, a man who had been laying track for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad came in with a laceration across his forearm that needed stitching. He had been turned away from 2 other places in town, not for any medical reason. He sat in Shane's surgery and held perfectly still while she cleaned the wound, and when she had finished he paid the fee without complaint, which was 50 cents, and thanked her formally in a manner that suggested he was not accustomed to being thanked in return. Shane thanked him for his patience. In July, a Ute woman arrived with a child who had been burned on the arm by a cooking fire. Shane treated the burn and sent the mother home with a preparation for the skin and instructions she gave, through hand signs and a borrowed word or two of Ute that she had learned from Cora, who had picked them up over years of mail deliveries to the camp near the northern ridgeline. The word for thank you she already knew. Price heard about both visits. He did not approve. He said so to 2 of his council members in terms that made it clear the issue was not medicine but manners, by which he meant an idea about which doors ought to stay open and which ones ought not to. Shane did not attend the council meeting where this was discussed. She was not invited. Cora attended in her capacity as clerk and took the minutes with her customary precision, and when she delivered Shane's copy of the relevant paragraph the following morning, she had underlined it twice. Shane read it, folded it, and went back to work. By September, there were perhaps 30 households in Harlan and the surrounding valley that would send for Shane Ford without hesitation if someone fell ill or broke a bone or started a fever in the night. Perhaps another 40 that would send for her if no one else were available, and a smaller number centered around Price and the men who shared his particular way of estimating things, that were still waiting to see whether this situation resolved itself before they were obliged to have a firmer opinion about it. Jesse Holt was in none of these groups. He was a homesteader 9 miles out on the South Road, 43 years old, with 80 acres under partial cultivation and a herd of 22 cattle, and a wife named Margaret who was expecting their second child in late autumn. Jesse was a practical man who had formed his view of Shane Ford from a single piece of information, which was that she was not the doctor Harlan had asked for. He held this view without hostility. He simply had not updated it. Margaret had her own views, which she kept to herself, which was her habit in most things. The expected child was due in October by Margaret's reckoning, though a woman's reckoning is not always the same as a child's. October passed without event. The first week of November came cold and clear, and then the second week came colder. On the 14th of November, the snow began. By evening, it was a storm, and by full dark, it was a blizzard, with horizontal wind driving down from the northwest and the temperature dropping past 20 and still falling. Margaret's labor began sometime around 9 o'clock that night. Jesse knew the signs from the first child, though the first had come easily, and this one from the first hour did not. By midnight, the labor had been going 3 hours without progress, and Margaret had stopped making noise, which was worse than the noise because it meant she was past the point of being frightened and into the point of being somewhere else entirely. Jesse had a neighbor he could have ridden for, another homesteader 4 miles east with a wife who had experience with difficult births. He had started for the door twice with that intention. Both times he came back. The neighbor's wife had helped with the Callaway birth last winter, and the child had not survived, and Jesse had never said a word about this to anyone, but he had not forgotten it. There was a doctor in a town called Garnet, 23 miles west, who had practiced there for 9 years and was known to be capable and male, and everything a doctor was supposed to be. Jesse thought about riding for Garnet. He calculated the distance in the blizzard, the time it would take, and what was happening in the bedroom while he calculated. Then he thought about Shane Ford. He did not spend a long time on this. He was past the point of having preferences. He saddled the horse in 4 minutes, which was fast work for a blizzard, and rode into the storm toward Harlan. The light was on in Shane's surgery. It was usually on. She had a habit of reading late, and had also, early in her time in Harlan, learned that a dark window at midnight sent a message she did not intend to send. She heard the horse before she heard the knock, and was already at the door when Jesse's fist came down on it. He told her in 8 words. She had her coat on before he finished the sentence. The ride out was 9 miles and took the better part of an hour in the conditions. Jesse's horse was steady, a gray gelding with a broad chest that drove through the drifts without flinching, and Shane rode her own mare alongside him, the instrument bag strapped across her back, both of them hunched against the wind and not talking, because talking in a blizzard of that intensity is a way of losing heat you cannot afford to lose. The temperature was somewhere below 20. The snow cut sideways. The only light was the faint blue-gray cast of the storm itself against the white ground. Shane thought about the obstetric volume she had finished on the train, and then returned by mail. She had read it twice before sending it back. She thought about what Dr. Marsh had written in the margins of a similar volume during a practical session 2 years before, in a hospital ward in St. Louis, while teaching her to assess a position by palpation rather than assumption. She thought about the specific sequence of things that would need to happen in a particular order, in a cold, one-room cabin, in the dark, with limited supplies and no one to assist. She thought about the fire. The fire would need to be higher. When they reached the cabin, the temperature inside was not much warmer than outside. Margaret was on the bed in the back room, conscious but quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that is not calm, but exhaustion. The lamp was turned low. Shane turned it up, fed the fire with the wood from the pile beside the hearth until the room began to return to something livable, and washed her hands with the carbolic solution from the bag, while Jesse stood at the door of the bedroom looking at his wife, and then at Shane with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has put everything down on one decision and cannot now reconsider. "Sit with her," Shane told him, "and keep the fire." He sat. He kept the fire. The labor had been going 7 hours by then. The child, poorly positioned, turned partly sideways, and Margaret's body exhausted past its natural inclination to push. Shane worked by feel as much as sight, her hands moving in the confined space with a precision born from years of practice on models and cadavers, and the 4 cases she had attended as a student under Dr. Marsh's supervision. Each attempt to shift the child's position required stillness and patience, because force in the wrong direction accomplished nothing and cost Margaret what little reserve she had left. Shane had been told by a senior physician at her college that obstetric work was 90% patience and 10% knowing exactly when patience was done. She had disagreed with the proportion, but understood the principle. The hours went in the way that hours go when every minute is fully occupied with a single demanding thing. Jesse fed the fire every 20 minutes without being asked. He brought water when Shane asked for it, and said nothing when she did not ask. Sometime around 3 in the morning, he heated a pan of water on the stove and set it near the bedroom door without Shane's instruction, having reasoned that she would need it at some point, which was correct. The child arrived at 11 minutes past 3, which was 14 hours after the labor had begun, and approximately 2 hours after Shane had finished the repositioning and the long, patient work of helping Margaret's exhausted body complete what it had started. It was a girl. She was small and dark-haired, and she filled the cabin with the particular kind of noise that means everything is going to be all right. And Jesse made a sound from the doorway that was not a word, but contained everything a word could hold. Margaret, who had not spoken above a whisper for the last 4 hours, looked at Shane with the direct, clear gaze of someone returned from a very long distance, and said, "I knew you'd come," Shane said. "Rest now." She stayed until first light to be certain. The snow had slowed by dawn, the storm easing off in that gradual way that made the landscape outside the cabin window look quiet and permanent and freshly arranged, the drifts carved into smooth curves by the tail end of the wind. Shane ate a piece of bread Jesse brought her and drank coffee and sat with the instrument bag across her knees and looked at Margaret sleeping with the child in the crook of her arm, and she felt the specific quality of tiredness that comes not from depletion, but from expenditure, from having spent yourself fully on something worth spending. She rode back to Harlan in the early morning, the storm entirely done, the sky above the mountains a clean pale gray, turning slowly to blue. The town was not yet awake when she came in off the south road. She put the horse in the livery, walked up to the surgery room, hung her coat, washed her hands a second time out of habit, and sat down in the chair by the cold stove. She didn't write a report. There was no one to send it to. She was asleep in the chair when Cora Briggs came by at 9 with a heel of bread and a opinion, which was her usual morning combination. Word moved through Harlan the way word always moves through a small town. which is to say quickly, and without a clear point of origin. By midday on the 15th, most of the town knew that Jesse Holt had ridden through a blizzard to get the doctor, and that the doctor had ridden back through it, and that Margaret and the child were alive. Jesse came into town 2 days later to buy flour and nails and a length of muslin, and the way he moved through the general store was the same as always, except that when Price's name came up in conversation near the pickle barrel, Jesse set down his nails and turned around slowly and said what he thought. He did not say a great deal. He said that a man who would write a letter to St. Louis about getting a real doctor ought to ride 9 miles in a blizzard first and form his opinion after, and that he himself had ridden those miles and had formed his. He said this in the particular tone of a man who has made up his mind and would not be revising it. Then he picked up his nails and paid for his flour. 3 people heard him say it. In a town of 400, 3 people is enough. The council met the following week, a regular meeting concerned with road repair and the water supply from the upper creek, both of which were pressing. Price called the meeting to order. He moved through the items on the agenda in his usual methodical manner. The road repair was discussed and a plan adopted. The water supply was discussed and deferred to the spring. At the end of the meeting, when the items were exhausted, one of the council members looked at Price and asked whether the matter of riding to St. Louis was still under consideration. Price looked at the table for a moment. "No," he said. He did not explain. The council member did not press him. The meeting adjourned. If you have ever known a man of that particular kind, careful and proud and slow to revise a view that has been publicly held, you may understand that no is a difficult word under those conditions, and that the difficulty of saying it is not a sign of insincerity. Price did not believe then that he had been wrong in a simple way. He believed more precisely that the situation had answered itself, and that his further commentary was not required. He would not fully come to the other understanding for another year or 2, and when he did, he would express it not by saying anything but by voting yes on every measure the council took in Shane's favor. And there were several of those over the years, and he voted yes on all of them. Shane did not attend the council meeting. She was treating a case of pneumonia in an elderly woman who lived above the milliner's shop on the north side of the main street, a woman who had come to the territory in 1858 and had outlasted 2 husbands and a flood, and did not intend to be brought down by a fever in her own bedroom. She was not, as it turned out. She recovered in 10 days and lived another 9 years. December came and settled over the valley with the full weight of a Colorado winter. The surgery room above the feed supply was warm enough now, with both stoves running and the caulked floor doing its work, and there was a second chair that Cora had brought up from her own parlor on a Tuesday without being asked, which was how Cora expressed a considered and definitive opinion. The shelves were full. The carbolic bottle had been replaced twice since March. The lamp chimney had been replaced once more, by a different hand this time, Jesse Holt having left a new one at the surgery door without knocking, sometime in late November, along with a paper-wrapped piece of cured pork that Shane ate over 3 evenings while reading. There were patients every week now, from most parts of the valley and some from beyond it. A family of 4 who had come up from New Mexico and spoken no English sent the oldest daughter, 15, who spoke a little, and Shane treated all 4 and learned enough Spanish to manage the follow-up visits. Dumas from the hardware brought his mother in January with a cough that had been worsening since autumn, and Shane treated her and told him what to watch for, and he came back every 2 weeks to report, standing in the surgery doorway in his careful way, not wanting to take up space he had not been invited to take. She invited him to take it. In February, the county seat sent a letter inquiring about the professional status of Harlan's physician of record for purposes of the county medical register. a new registry being established under the territorial authority. The letter was addressed to the council. Price brought it to the post office to respond, and Cora, who drafted the reply at his dictation, was precise in every particular. She wrote that Harlan's physician of record was Shane Ford, licensed by a medical college in St. Louis, practicing in Harlan since March of 1883, and that the town considered itself well served. Price signed it. Cora sealed it and posted it herself, which she would have done regardless, but the act of sealing it felt like something worth doing with care. The county register entry was made in the spring of 1884. It named Shane Ford as Harlan's physician of record. It was a plain line in a ledger that said exactly what it needed to say, and nothing beyond that, which was appropriate because the story was not in the ledger. The story was in the 9 miles of South Road and the cold cabin and the long counted hours of a November night, and in the 37 years of practice that followed, and in all the things that were built from that foundation, one season at a time. There is something in the way this niche of country works on a person. The high altitude and the long winters and the particular quality of light in a Colorado morning after fresh snow. Something that either sends a person away or turns them into something the place itself requires. Shane Ford became the second kind, which is to say she became necessary, which is another way of saying she learned the place rather than simply living in it. She learned which families were too proud to send for her until the situation was past ignoring, and she made a point of stopping in on those families during her routine rides through the valley, framing the visit as a courtesy call, which it partly was and partly was not. She learned which children came to her surgery on their own, without their parents, with a careful story about a minor complaint that was actually a request for information their parents would not provide. And she gave that information in plain terms and sent them home without embarrassing them. She learned the water quality from the upper creek in wet years versus dry ones, and what it did to the summer stomach complaints. And she wrote a letter to the county about it that was ignored for 3 years and then implemented without attribution, which she had expected. She was 30 years old when Harlan incorporated as a full township in 1887, and there was a modest celebration at the Grange Hall, and she was invited, which would not have seemed unremarkable except that 2 years before she would not have been. She wore her good dress and stayed 2 hours, and danced once with Dumas, who was a careful dancer with an unexpectedly good ear for rhythm, and once with Jessie Holt, who was not a careful dancer and knew it, and was cheerful about the fact. Cora Briggs did not dance, but stood at the side of the room with a cup of cider, and the expression of a woman who is satisfied with how things have arranged themselves, which was her characteristic expression at events she had quietly helped arrange. Margaret's daughter, the child born on that November night, was named Clara. Clara Holt grew up in the valley and attended the school in Harlan, and proved to have the particular kind of mind that is always slightly ahead of whatever is in front of it, which made her both an excellent student and a restless one. She was taught by 3 teachers over the years in Harlan, and each of them told Jessie the same thing, which was that Clara ought to be educated beyond what the Valley School could offer. Jessie listened to this advice the 3rd time it was given and took it seriously, and when Clara was 17, he arranged for her to go to a school in Denver, which she did, and then to a teacher's college, which required 2 more years of arrangements and a loan from the county bank that Jessie paid back ahead of schedule and mentioned to no one. Clara Holt became a schoolteacher, as it turned out, which was what the Story Lock knew long before the Valley did, and she taught for 31 years. And she named her first classroom the way teachers name things that matter to them, which is to say she named it nothing formal but kept a particular book on the desk that she had been given as a gift when she left for Denver, a volume on the natural history of the Colorado mountains, inscribed on the front page in a plain hand. with respect for what you will become. Shane had written it. She was 34 when she wrote it. She had another 30 years of practice ahead of her. The winters continued to be hard, because that is the nature of a Colorado winter, and the practice continued to grow, because that is the nature of doing good work in a small place over a long time. By 1895, Shane had treated nearly every family in the valley at least once. By 1900, the surgery room above the feed supply had been replaced by a proper building, 2 rooms with a real floor and a separate washroom, built by a subscription among the valley families that Cora organized with the efficiency of a woman who has spent 20 years running the town's information exchange and knows exactly who owes whom a favor. The building took 3 weeks to frame and 2 more to finish, and on the last day of the second week, when the last board was nailed down, Jesse Holt drove in from the homestead with a load of pine firewood and stacked it beside the door without being asked. There were 7 cords of it. Cora counted. Shane practiced until 1921, which was 38 years from the March morning she stepped off the train at the Harlan Depot with her instrument bag and her plain hat, and her list of what needed doing. She was 64 years old, and her hands had begun to trouble her in the cold, which had been true for several winters. But by 1921, the trouble was persistent enough that she could no longer depend on the precision she required. And a physician who cannot depend on her hands cannot practice medicine, which is a simple fact and one she had known she would one day face. She made the decision in the autumn, when the mountains had begun to turn, and the light had the particular quality of Colorado October, amber and long-shadowed, and exactly as clear as the best thinking. She told Cora first. Cora said, "Well," and looked out the post office window at the street. Then she said, "You'll still ride." Shane said that she intended to. She did for another 3 years, until riding also became complicated. She is buried on the pine-studded ridge above Harlan, where the ground levels briefly before the slope rises again toward the tree line, and the grave looks south down the valley toward the Homestead Road, and on clear days toward the long white edge of the mountains beyond. The headstone is plain granite, the name and dates cut deep enough to last. It says what it needs to say. The instrument bag, the plain brown leather one with the brass clasp that she packed on the last evening of February 1883 in a rooming house on Chestnut Street in St. Louis, was kept by the Holt family. Jessie had died by then, and Margaret a few years after, but Clara kept it in her classroom for the last 10 years of her teaching, and when she retired she took it home and set it on the shelf above the writing desk where it remained for the rest of her life. The leather had worn smooth around the clasp from years of handling. The brass had gone dark. Clara's students sometimes asked about it, and she told them in the plain and patient voice of a woman who has told a true story many times and has not tired of it, because true stories do not tire the teller the way invented ones do. She told them about the night her mother nearly did not survive, and the woman who rode through the blizzard, and the town that had not said a word on a March morning and then said nothing for a second time. A different kind of nothing, when it finally understood what it had been given. If you have known anyone like Shane Ford, you will recognize that particular quality of people who simply begin the work, who do not wait for permission, and who build something that outlasts not just the doubters, but the doubting itself. If you have, leave a word below about them. And when you're ready for another story about a person the frontier underestimated, there is one waiting. The bag sits on the shelf in Clara's house, on a cold morning in Harlan, worn smooth and dark and perfectly still, the way things are when they have been used up to the edges of what they were made for, and then kept anyway, because some things you do not set down,